Following the release and success of the King of Fighters 95, it was clear that SNK had a brand new flagship series that surpassed all expectations. It was also decided that this new series would see yearly sequels and become SNK's most important IP. As previously stated, during the early development of the King of Fighters 95, SNK planned to redo the entire sprites for the game, a monumental task that was abandoned early on as it would have required more time to release the highly anticipated first King of Fighters sequel. But now that the game had become SNK's biggest IP, it was time to revive the ambitious idea of revamping the series. Immediately after the release of the King of Fighters 95, SNK started work on the next chapter. The sprite redesign intended for the previous game became a key aspect of the new one. The developers decided to redraw every single character from scratch to add more fluidity and more moves to the now iconic roster. But redoing the art wasn't enough for SNK. The company wanted to ensure that each KOF sequel would bring something new to the franchise rather than just minor changes to the game and characters. For that reason, the entire gameplay of the King of Fighters was revamped. This ambitious plan resulted in a massive workload for the development team as the game was not fully completed until just few days before its intended release. Following the announcement and the first reveal of the new game, titled The King of Fighters 96, it was very clear that this was the next iteration of the franchise. The graphics looked like nothing the Neo Geo had ever produced, pushing the system to its limit and utilizing the full VRAM capabilities capped at 68 KB of RAM as well as the full 64 KB of system memory. The King of Fighters 96 sprites looked bigger, better, and beautifully animated. It was clear that SNK was creating the most visually stunning fighting game of the time. SNK's graphics mastery extended beyond the sprites to the stages, which were filled with animated spectators and included brand new stage intros. Since the very first King of Fighters game, the series always generated hype around the rotating roster, and the King of Fighters 96 was no exception. The character roster underwent major changes since the previous game. While many of the previous teams returned, there were several changes and new additions as well. The rival team, introduced in the King of Fighters 95 to great reception, had disbanded. Due to Iori Yagami's massive popularity, the new Yagami team was introduced. Joining Iori were two previously seen characters, Mature and Vice, who were Rugal's secretaries from the King of Fighters 94 and the King of Fighters 95 respectively. Their inclusion also played into the overarching narrative of the series. The second new team added to the game was one intended for the King of Fighters 95, the Boss Team, composed of Geese Howard, Wolfgang Krauser, and Mr. Big, the main bosses of the Fatal Fury and Auto Fighting series. The Boss Team was one of the first new teams considered for the King of Fighters 96, as the SNK developers team had wanted to add these 3 SNK bosses in the previous sequel but were unable to due to time constraints. The Boss Team received special treatment such as music for each individual member, in contrast to other teams who only had one. This gave the three boss characters more personality and gravitas and emphasized their significance when added to the King of Fighters. However, due to memory restrictions, some of the special moves designed for Geese Howard had to be left out of the game. As previously mentioned, some of the traditional King of Fighters teams received major changes. First was the auto fighting team, which now included Yuri Sakazaki instead of her father Takuma. Since Yuri was no longer part of the women fighters team, a new member was added to the game, Kasumi Todo, who was introduced due to the coinciding release of Auto Fighting 3, which made the character popular. The Ikari team also saw a shakeup, as Hyder was no longer playable. In his place, Leona, his adoptive daughter, made her debut. Leona, who would become an important part of the narrative, went through multiple designs before the final one. The developers wanted to add a second female fighter to the Ikari team, a woman who uses a whip in battle, but due to time constraints, the idea was abandoned and later resurfaced when the King of Fighters 99 was being developed, which is something we'll discuss in a future chapter. Two new boss characters were introduced to the series with the King of Fighters 96. First was the tournament's new organizer Chizuru Kagura, who would become an important part of the narrative, as well as the new powerful final boss, Genitz. Several new characters were considered for the new sequel, including a new fighter who initially looked like a fusion between Kyo and Yori's designs. This idea eventually evolved into the character of Shingo Yabuki for the sequel. Other character ideas and designs were considered, but ultimately dropped. Graphics and roster weren't the only things that saw big changes, as the gameplay itself underwent a massive overhaul, making this game feel like a soft reboot of the King of Fighters franchise. The biggest change that players noticed when playing the new game was how the King of Fighters 96 removed most long-range projectiles in favor of short-range ones. Characters like Ryo Sakazaki and Robert Garcia, whose popular projectiles, the Hoken, no longer traveled across the screen, and now has more of a push mechanic than a projectile. Kyo Kusanagi's playstyle was completely changed, replacing his fireball with a multi-hit fiery punches. Yori remained one of the few characters whose projectile attacks stayed the same. This was a huge gamble for SNK, yet it wasn't the only major change in gameplay. The King of Fighters 96 introduced the roll mechanic. Unlike the dodge ability present in the King of Fighters 94 and 95, pressing A and B allowed the player to roll past attacks and get close to the opponent for an offensive opportunity. Pressing back and A plus B allowed the character to roll backwards away from the opponent. This installment also introduced two more mechanics that would become staples for the series going forward. The ability to run, which replaced the forward hop dashes, and the possibility to determine the height of the character's jump, introducing the famous hops that are now a series-defining feature. Interestingly, command normals are absent in this iteration. The POW gauge also received major changes. When a fighter took damage or blocked attacks, the meter gauge gradually filled up, with the rate depending on how strong the hit was. Getting hit by multi-hit attacks caused the gauge to fill faster. Players could also manually charge the gauge using the Power Builder Surge move by pressing A, B, and C simultaneously, but this, as in the previous games, left the fighter highly vulnerable. Once the gauge was fully charged, it reaches the maximum level, and the fighter's offensive power temporarily increases. During this heightened state, players could unleash the character's unique desperation move for massive damage. The max state, however, only lasts for a short period of time. Additionally, when the POW gauge was filled to the max from blocking or taking damage, it depletes faster. However, Using the Power Builder surge to charge the gauge gave players more time in the max state before it drains completely. The character's life gauge had 6 segments, and when it drops below 2, it starts flashing red. During this critical phase, characters could perform desperation moves repeatedly without needing a full POW gauge, similar to the previous King of Fighters titles. A new feature in this game, however, allowed players to execute a super desperation move if their life gauge was flashing red and their POW meter was full, dealing up to double the damage of the regular version of these supers and offering different flashy animation. This could be a game changer, providing a chance to turn the tide of the battle. Since SNK took the story of the King of Fighters franchise very seriously, the developers team used this new chapter to further elaborate on the intricate and expanding lore. They were also clever in injecting some of the lore into the game by adding special character introductions when certain fighters faced each other. This little addition added a lot of personality to the game and showed how much SNK respected the lore of the franchise. The story of the King of Fighters 96 takes place a few months after the previous game, with Rugal Bernstein defeated and the mystery of Orochi beginning to unfold. The series protagonist Kyo Kusanagi now sees himself as an invincible fighter, only to be approached by a mysterious figure who challenges the Kusanagi heir to a fight. This man is so powerful that Kyo, the hero team leader, cannot land a single blow against him. Badly injured, Kyo is rushed to the hospital where Benimaru and Goro are waiting for him. Feeling humiliated, Kyo decides to take his training more seriously and makes it his goal to exact revenge on this mysterious foe. A few months after this incident, the King of Fighters 96 is announced, but with a twist. The event has now exploded in popularity, and this new tournament will be hosted on an international level. Kyo and his friends from the hero team once again, and many teams from the previous tournaments, make a comeback. Some in familiar fashion, like the Fate of Yuri team, and others with unexpected changes, like the Ikari team, with their leader Haydn stepping aside for his adopted daughter Leona to join Ralph and Clark. The biggest surprise among the participating teams, however, is undoubtedly the Yagami team, consisting of Iori Yagami and Rugal's previous secretaries Vice and Mature. These two mysterious women tracked Iori before the tournament and persuaded him to join their team, promising to help him get the fight against Kyo that he always wanted. Once again, the tournament ran its course with the teams fighting spectacular battles. The hero team, composed of Kyo, Benimaru and Goro, reached the finals once again and is greeted by a mysterious woman, Chizuru Kagura, who reveals herself as the organizer of this year's tournament, as well as the guardian. She explains that her true goal was to lure out the Kusanagi and Yagami heirs to unite and fight the real threat, the awakening of Orochi. But before she can elaborate further, the man who previously defeated Kyo and sent him to the hospital makes his entrance and destroys the stadium where the finals are being held. His name is Genet, and he reveals himself as the leader of the Hakeshu, the powerful warriors of the Orochi clan. He also reveals that Mature and Vice were working under him all along and were keeping an eye on Iori Yagami, since he is a descendant of the Yasakani, and thus the Orochi blood runs in his veins as a result of the blood pact that his ancestor made with Orochi 660 years ago. Seeing an opportunity to finally end all three heirs of the clans that defeated his demon master 1800 years ago at once, Genet attacks the trio but is ultimately defeated by Kyo with the help of Iori and Chizuru. Humiliated, Genet takes his own life. Understanding what lies ahead, Chizuru asks Kyo and Iori to put their differences aside and join her as their ancestors once did, to be ready to fight and prevent the resurrection of Orochi. However, both Kyo and Iori reject the idea of working together and go their separate ways. With such an ambitious graphical and gameplay overhaul, the development period of the King of Fighters 96 extended right up to its scheduled release, and understandably so. At the location test for the game, which was only a few weeks before its release, Mature and Vice were still not included in the game, as the staff did not have enough time to complete them. But that did not stop the great reception the game received at its first location test. The risky changes to projectiles and gameplay mechanics from the King of Fighters 95 were welcomed by fans, giving SNK confidence before releasing the game. The King of Fighters 96 was released in arcades on July 30th, 1996 to great reception, particularly in Japan. Game Machine magazine listed the King of Fighters 96 on their September 1st, 1996 issue as the most successful arcade game of the month. According to Famitsu, the Neo Geo AES version sold over 33,000 copies in its first week. The game received both praise and criticism from non-Japanese video game publications. For example, Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the Neo Geo AES version 7.5 out of 10, citing the huge roster of fighters, the retention of the series' strong playability. However, they criticized it for failing to improve graphically over the previous installment, something that Japanese publications did not agree with. Following its arcade release, the game was ported to the Neo Geo and Neo Geo CD, with these versions launching on September 27th and October 25th of the same year, respectively. The Sega Saturn version arrived later on December 31st, and the PlayStation version followed until July 4th, 1997.
アーケードの興奮が迫力が快感がついにサターンにやってきたサターン版 The King of Fighters 96 coming soon SNK.
Unlike its predecessor, the PlayStation and Saturn ports were exclusive to Japan, though they offered a language setting that allowed players to switch the game to English. The Saturn version of the game also supported a 1 meg RAM cartridge, which enabled additional animations that wouldn't fit into the Saturn's internal memory. A Saturn Best Collection edition was released on October 1998. The PlayStation version was a bestseller and was later re-released as part of the PlayStation The Best series in Japan. A special database titled The King of Fighters 96 Neo Geo Collection was released on February 14, 1997. To coincide with the release of the King of Fighters 97. This collection was exclusive to the Neo Geo CD and featured a wealth of content, including the game's intro, an interactive reenactment of the backstory, character profiles narrated by the respective voice actors, outtakes, a gallery section with exclusive artwork from the creators, a complete command list, and a sound selection. A similar version, dubbed the King of Fighters 96 Perfect File, was later released for Windows and Macintosh computers on June 1997. This version retained most of the features found in the original Neo Geo CD release. Similar to the previous installment, a Game Boy adaptation of the King of Fighters 96 was released by Takara in Japan under the title Netto The King of Fighters 96 on August 1997. This version was later brought to Europe in 1998 as the King of Fighters Heat of Battle. The Game Boy version improved graphically from its predecessor and pushed the Game Boy to its limits. Netto King of Fighters 96 featured only 17 of the original 29 characters due to the memory limits of the Game Boy cartridges. As it was customary for Takara Game Boy ports, the King of Fighters 96 featured several hidden characters and modes. Besides the ability to play as the bosses Chizuru and Genet, the King of Fighters 96 on the Game Boy added two exclusive characters that would play an important role in the mainline sequel, Orochi Iori and Orochi Leona. These two versions were different from the eventual ones seen in the King of Fighters 97, and were called in this game Iori Dash and Leona Dash. This marked the first time these two fighters were playable in the series. Mr. Karate, a version of Takuma Sakazaki, was also included as both a secret boss and an unlockable character. Netto King of Fighters 96 also included a secret Carnage mode, which allowed the power gauge to fill automatically without charging enabling players to use more powerful versions of super special moves and regular special moves without needing low health. In 1998, a pirated version of the game was created for the NES system by a company called Hummer Team. This unauthorized version included only 7 characters: Leona, Iori, Chizuru, Genitz, Yuri, Goro, and King. Although the initial plan was to feature 20 characters, 13 of them were ultimately removed. These cut characters included Kyo, Benimaru, Terry Bogard, Andy, Joe Higashi, Ryo Sagasaki, Kim, Raph, Athena, Kasumi, Mai, Giz, and Krauser. Similar to the previous releases, the King of Fighters 96 received no anime adaptation. Around 1996, SNK had abandoned its plans for anime adaptations for its properties following the abysmal reception of most adaptations, with the exception of the Fatal Fury anime series by Masami Obari. In terms of manga, there were multiple Koma mangas or comedy comic books adapting stories from the King of Fighters 96. However, 2 manga series took themselves more seriously. The first was the King of Fighters G by Ryota Kamisaki, a sequel to the King of Fighters 94 Gaiden manga. And like its prequel, was an adaptation of the King of Fighters 96, but from the perspective of Athena Asamiya. The story took many liberties but was well received by fans. The second manga series, which would have a big impact on the franchise as a whole, is the King of Fighters Kyo by Masato Natsumoto. This manga, which lasted for 3 volumes, was launched to coincide with the release of the King of Fighters 96. The story retells the events of the King of Fighters 96, albeit differently from the game it is based on. For example, the manga does not show all the game's roster, and there was no tournament setting. The manga also introduced the idea of Kyo and Iori as talented musicians, which added to their lore. Despite its changes to the lore, the King of Fighters Kyo was considered the most successful manga of the King of Fighters franchise and helped pave the way for a future King of Fighters RPG. The King of Fighters' popularity in China also spanned a Chinese comic or a manhwa depicting the events of the King of Fighters 96. Though the book will infamously go down as an odd adaptation that took so many liberties and adopted over-the-top fights and stories. The King of Fighters 96 also marks the first time the famed writer Akihiko Ureshino writing a light novel about the title. Titled The King of Fighters 96 Rumbling on the City, this official novelization focuses on Leona and Iori. This will not be the only time that Ureshino will write official novels for the King of Fighters titles. The release of the King of Fighters 96 coincided with the height of the series' popularity. The characters of the franchise became larger than life, with fans obsessed with their voice actors and seeking more information about these fighters. SNK capitalized on this by introducing a number of original products to the market. One such project was the Band of Fighters. The Band of Fighters was a character-themed image band featuring Kyo Kusanagi, Iori Yagami, Terry Bogard, Nakururu from Samurai Showdown, and Athena Asamiya. Set in an alternate universe from their usual game narrative, these fighters resolved their conflicts through singing and dancing. The concept was expanded to include other popular characters as guest stars in their performances. Various merchandise items including mugs and key holders were produced for the band, along with drama CDs that chronicled their adventures. Band of Fighters was more than just a concept, it was also an event held at the Neo Geo World, first premiering in 1996. The show featured audio animatronic versions of the 5 characters who sang and performed their songs on stage, accompanied by a monitor displaying select character portraits. The stage that hosted these robot performances was also used for live shows, special events, concerts, and announcements involving the game voice actors. With the King of Fighters 96 release to great success, SNK was already planning for another sequel, one that would go down as the peak title in terms of story and lore. as well as letting a different studio adapt the franchise into a different genre. But this is something we're going to see in the next chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and subscribe if you have not done so, and big shout out to the channel's patrons and premium subscribers. You can become a channel patron or a premium subscriber by checking the link in the description below and getting exclusive goodies in the process. Thank you for your support, and see you guys next time.